Hi there. Welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're continuing on Book 3 on the discussion of the regime, looking at Book 7. Last chapter we dealt with the definition of the regime, of defining it, and looking at the question of what political rule is, and the nature of the city, that is shared mutual benefit. Okay, not only living but also living well. He there even asserted his basic principle that man is from chapter 2 of Book 1, that man is a political animal, and therefore ideas that return to the kind of naturalism argument, the idea of the organic political life, and that therefore that man, the purpose of coming together is not only about, yes, primarily, at the necessity level, to securing the means of living, but also to live well. The goal of man is both individually and collectively is living well. So now we're going to be looking at the regime, right? The question of the regime, and that's how we saw that the good regime is the regime of political rule that achieves political rule that allows us to rule for the common advantage, and those are defective are those who seek that don't rule for the common advantage and have to, because they're ruling for the sake of the ruling or some other element, and therefore they need to be coercive, where that the city should be ruled by free people, ruling of free people, not of masters. There's a distinction that political life is not mere despotic, and that therefore the defective rule becomes increasingly like the rule of master. Right? That's how we ended the last chapter. Today we're looking at chapter 7, which let's turn to now. These things have been determined. The next thing is to investigate regime. So therefore, this is where he switches really to regimes, and that was more about the question of rule, right? The types of rule and the question of rule. Now, how many in number and what sorts they are, and first of all, the correct ones, right? The correct regimes. Okay. For the deviations will be evident once they have been determined. So we can first we have to talk about the correct regimes. The idea is deviate regimes are the defective deficiencies or falling away from what is proper. That's the idea. In other words, it's not that the defectives will produce the good. The good is first. That then things become less, or through defect become less good. So, in other words, in other words, the idea here is that the good is not something that evolves, but rather it's there in principle, but then it's there, and then what happens is deficiencies are falling away from it, right? But is the failure or defects from, okay? So therefore, let's go to determine, right? It says, now he says this, since the regime, politeia, and the polituma signify the same thing. Now, this is 34, which he says the term governing body derives from politeia. More colloquial might be the political class, right? This is, I think, the ruling body, those who rule, those who this. The governing body or the ruling body, or those who, the polituma is the ruling part, right? The ruling part. But the regime and the ruling part signify the same thing, since the governing body is the ruling element in the city, the authoritative element within the city. And since it is necessary that the ruling element be either one, few, or many, one, mono, oloi, and poloi. Okay, one, few, many. When the one or the few or the many rule with a view to the common advantage, those regimes are necessarily correct, while those with a view to the private advantage of the one or the few or the multitude are deviations. So if the ruler is, whether the one, few, or many, if they're ruling for their own sake, they're deviations. If they're ruling for the common advantage of the whole community, then they're proper rules. So therefore, we have the ones who rule. Who are ruled? Well, who are the rulers? Well, they can be one, few, one all, few, oi, I think it's holoi, right? And then the poi poloi, right? The many, hoi poloi, right? Holokoi, hoi poloi, right? The few and the many, right? That's the classic distinction of politics: the few and the many. Um, 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 Now let's continue here. This is going to be a short chapter for us. For either it must be denied that persons taking part in the regime are citizens, or that they must share in advantages. In other words, if you're going to be partaking in the city, you must share an advantage. If you're going to be partaking in the regime, but the regime is going to give advantage. It should be advantages to the whole, then people should share in it, right? Either it must be denied that persons taking the regime are citizens, or they must take. Therefore, there must be. If you're citizens, you must be getting some advantage of this. Okay, must share in the advantages of it. That's the common advantages in that sense. Benefits, the goods, the good things. Now, monarchies, one-archies, the rules of one, that form which look towards the common advantage, we are accustomed to call basileos, kingship. The rule of the few, but of more than one person, we are accustomed. Again, this is commonly. This is what. It's not that this is custom. This is actually interesting. This is not. It's not truth. Is that this is what we're used to calling it. To calling it aristocracy, because either the best persons are ruling, or because they are ruling with a view to what is best for the city and for those who are sharing in it. So that's a weird thing. So we call it the aristocracy. An aristocracy literally means the rule of the best. So is it the rule of the best because they're the best ones, or that their rule is best, and that they're ruling for the common advantage of together? Right? He says. So that's why aristocracy is kind of a weird term. We call this rule of the few aristocracy, accustomed to calling it, because it's ruling for the. But is it the rule of the best ones, or is it their rule is best? Okay. Now he says, sharing in a semicolon. And when the multitude governs with a view towards the common advantage, it is the term called by the term common to all regimes. Not polity. This is a interpretation. This is 35. This is where I disagree with him. He says, wherever Aristotle uses the term politeia to refer to a particular type of regime, it will be translated as polity. Wrong! We shouldn't be doing this. Politeia should be always translated as regime, and therefore to understand, by doing this way, he clarifies what Aristotle wants problematic. He wants the pun, the regime called regime. The regime called regime. So this is where I'm going to really object to Lord and the whole tradition, because this is a thing. This is something that Robertson, in this commentary from Oxford back in the early 60s, in the first volume 3, volume 4 of the Oxford Clarendon series on the commentaries that were done, part of that only Robertson did himself, raised this problem. And I think Robertson got it right. That this is an interpretation that you have to do it this way. And we should, if we're going to keep the text, if you want a translation should keep us we should see how the Greek text looks like. And therefore, by doing this, this is where Lord kind of, again, fudges things. Remember, this is similar to the fudge of Agathos and Spudaios that we had earlier. This is another fudge, translation fudge, that I think mars. But this is something that's common. He's not doing anything that other translators have done as well. And this is a problem in that sense. Therefore, this is right. In other words, we call this, and this is odd that the rule of the many that we call this is we do call it the common terms of regime. Why? Why is this done? Okay, this happens reasonably. This happens reasonably, right? First of all, this name is not based on truth of the thing, but rather the aristocracy one is something that simply happens by convention, not because it's the truth. It's because we're accustomed to it, right? We are accustomed to it. Not that it's true or it's real. This is the truth of the matter, but we call this aristocracy. And the double meaning of this. Well, why do we call it politeia? Why do we call this regime of the many or is the rule of the politeia necessary the rule of the many. The regime and political regime is the rule of the many universally, and that therefore oligarchy or monarchy aren't really regimes. This is something he will argue, and he'll argue that our kingship is not really politeia. In fact, this is something the Romans themselves would make point of, because remember, the translation for politeia in Latin is res publica, and that you have either the rex or the res publica. Where there's a rex, there's no republica. And this also agrees with the beginning of Book 1, who those who say that kingship and politicos are the same thing. Right? Remember that beginning of Book 1. The politicos, the basileos, and the oikonomikos and the despotike, that they're the same, and the only difference is the size of the thing. They argue wrongly. We blur that first part, the distinction between king and politicos. And I think this is something the Romans kind of understood, that they were saying that there's something anti-regime like. The monarchy is something apolitical. It's pre-political. And therefore there is something about the monarch. And there's maybe something about the oligarch. The oligarchy is a deficiency. And even therefore, aristocracy does not mean because they're the few. Aristocracy means it's the best, not the. In other words, that's the question, and that's why aristocracy is a problem. That's why it's going to be a big problem to say the aristocracy is the best regime is aristocracy. Why? Because it's saying that's an identity issue. That's like saying the rule aristocracy, rule of the best, is the best aristoi politeia. The rule of the best is the best regime. The rule of the best is the best regime. That's the rule of the best is the best. Not saying anything. That's an A equals A fallacy, right? So let's continue here. Um, this happens reasonably. So that's a very it happens reasonably. This kind of assumption, right? It is possible for one or few to be outstanding in virtue, but where more are concerned, it is difficult for them to be proficient with a view to virtue as a whole. But some level of proficiency is possible, particularly regarding military virtue, as this arises in the multitude. Hence, the regime, this regime, the warrior element is the most authoritative ruling. Well, wait a minute. Okay, this is what leads to the idea of the warrior and those participating in heavy arms who will take part in it. Okay, so therefore this leads to polity means warrior. This echoes that famous thing that in Plato, the cycle, that the oligarchs, the aristocracy regime comes to the son of honor lovers, right? The timocracy, right? And then that comes to the honor lovers produce the oligarchs. The oligarchs then produce Democrats, and Democrats produce. That's the cycle of regimes of Plato's Republic. Aristotle does not do this way. He says one, few, many. The best, the few, the many. The problem is that the many. It's hard for the many to be virtuous. It's the few, the one and the few can be virtuous. The one and the few can have access to being virtuous. But the many, that's the question, and that's going to be a big concern. The virtue of the many, right? The virtue of many. We discussion later in the politics where there's a dialogue about this. There's going to be a series of dialogues here. The first question is the question of regime, which we'll be seeing, and the second dialogue is going to be the kingship versus law. So this is a very interesting point here, and we should pay attention to this. He's saying that military virtue is possible, and hence, therefore, those who have arms, and therefore, in these cities, that it's the people who have arms who can afford the arms, the heavy arms, the hoplite to be able to front in the battlefield. That the soldiers are the most authoritative. This kind of regime, the politeia, is this. But by the way, and he will say later that was the early democracy. Democracy was this. That this was how democracy was understood. This is Solon's democracy. This discussion of those who are holding arms like this is Solon's democracy. So the original term for this, as he will say later in book 4, is that this was called democracy originally. But now we are accustomed to call it something not democracy. Because why? Because now his Athens is democracy is understood in terms of the now. And the now is this radical democracy, which is more the democracy of Athens at the time he's writing, which is a radical democracy, it's not the regime, the moderate democracy of Athens. So it's not that his point of view here is not that. See, and from the point of the radical democracy, the earlier democracy looks something different. It looks different in kind almost, and this is why it's called. We speak of it to the regime, but therefore the use of the calling it the regime rather than giving it a different name. Why not call it like what Plato says, timocracy, or the rule of the soldiers, the rule of the armed? Doesn't do that. It's the regime, Volatea, which is common to all regimes. That says something. This should get us thinking about this. By saying polity, we solve the problem. Oh, it's polity, different regime. No, we should. This problem is the problem about what is the regime and why. Who is the regime? Who is really the authoritative element in the regime? And what is truly a regime versus what is defectively a regime. One aspect is the common advantage, but maybe also the question of participation. His political idea is that of citizenship, and therefore there should be the citizens, and therefore all citizens should participate. Oligarchy is defective because it limits. It might even say, what's even more so, they say, well, but you could be a citizen, but to really be a citizen, we lie. Remember the deception that we lied, saying that the offices are only open to those who can afford it. Therefore, this is a lie that denying that really that if you can't share in the offices, then you're not really a citizen. That's even the more interesting point that he addresses here. Deviations from these mentioned are tyranny from kingship. So deviations and that's deviations means those who come. It's that thing that fall from it, right? Remember, this idea is that this is the proper form, and this is the things that fall from it, right? The deviation of monarchy leads to tyranny. Oligarchy from aristocracy, and democracy from regime. Mm-hmm. That's weird. But aren't these all regimes? Is regime the best regime? Is the best regime really a regime? But it's all types of regimes. So the best regime is a regime, and the pure regime is a regime. So therefore, isn't that the rule of the best? And that becomes a conundrum, right? Does not the aristocracy means the best rule, which is therefore the best regime? But then wait a minute, the regime is pure regime and is done right. So therefore, isn't that the best regime? Therefore, does not the one, few, and many collapse into the rule of the many? Because the many, by declaring, isn't the idea that only the one should rule or the many should rule is a denial of citizenship? This is the point here. This is why it's so interesting. This is the real debate that's in book 3. That this is the fight that will happen sooner here, right? So therefore, we have this argument that okay, these are definitions. It's one kingship for the common advantage. This is the famous typology. Common advantage, the ruler's advantage. Rule of the one, common advantage, kingship, the deficiency, that's where the ruler is ruling for his own advantage, tyranny. The few, the rule commonly understood as aristocracy for the common advantage. We call this common, it is held to be accustomed to call this aristocracy. Its defect is called oligarchy. Now, oligarchy means rule of the rich, right? We'll say about this, right? And democracy is a defect of regime. It's it's a deficiency. It's a defect of the efficiency. But wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. If the idea if the idea is citizenship is that all who partake in this, as we discussed earlier, and it's everyone who's a citizen is a citizen and must share and rule, and that if we don't make that clear that the one who doesn't share and rule is really an alien, is an act of deception. See that? See the problem here? See the conundrum here? So where does Aristotle stand here? Okay, this is the question. Now he says, well, tyranny is rule of the one, monarchy, with a view to the advantage of the one, the ruling one, the ruler, the one ruling. Oligarchy, oligarchic rule, oligarchy rule, oligarchic rule, the rule of the oligarchy, is oligarchy rule with a view. So the oligarchy, the regime, that regime rules with a view to the advantage of the well-off, by wealthy, the wealthy. This is the word upoios, the wealthy. Democracy rule with a view to the advantage of those who are poor, a prior. So the argument that democracy means the rule of those with a prior. None of them is with a view to the common gain. Oh, wait a minute, but But these three that he just mentioned, right? Tyranny, none of these would come in good. The problem here is that by defining it as the poor, not as the multitude, those without means, those without the means at all, not the wealthy. This is the tension between the rich and the poor. This, the well-off, the upoios, and the epoios. Then, therefore, this is the problem. Once he's done this, then we pay it. We're forced into a dichotomy that between the one, and the ones with money, or the ones. Well, wait a minute. How about the one? What is that? What makes the one the one? In other words, there's not a common reference between one, few, and many. This was number, but what distinguishes the few and the many is their wealth. Here, that is interesting in that sense. We get, in other words, the criteria what distinguishes the okoi and the poloi, the few and the many, is the few are upoyor, wealthy, and the many are a prior, about means. But what about one? What is the relationship? They are sharing a reference to means. What about the one? And that's the problem of this whole argument in that sense. Pardon. That's the problem with this argument, hence. We're going to be stopping here. Let me end here. If you have any comments, please put it below. And I will see them. I'll get them. If you liked it, like it. If you didn't like it, don't like it. If you liked it, you put say why. If you didn't like it, say why I didn't like it. And if you have, if you liked it, share it. Share it to friends. You can join it on subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. If you have any comments or concerns, I said that already. I'm late. I'm going to be late. So I have to wrap this up. Subscribe, and that way you get notifications. Encourage others to subscribe. I like to get to 300 in the beginning of the new year. Sometime in the beginning of this new year, which is now. You see this. Follow me on social media. The information below. You want to help? You want me to grow? You can do Subscribe Star, Patreon, or you can buy my book. I've shielded enough. This is not a commentary. This is a guide to this. That's it. I will talk to you. We look at chapter 8 sometime soon. Bye bye. Good. Hope you have a good day. Take care.